Hi, ladies. I have provided feedback for your final draft of your goals and objectives. For most of you, that occurred last week. I finished up the few that were remaining this morning. So everyone has been given final feedback for the goals and objectives. If you go into this week's goals and objectives final draft, you're going to have comments for recommended changes. Once you've made those final few tweaks, you're going to post that final polished version of your goals and objectives in Typhon. You'll post it under your external documents and make sure you're going to pull down the tab that says goals and objectives. That way it's properly labeled and that it shows up in Typhon for 619 and 620 folks that are the faculty that teach this course, so that they can see your goals and objectives as well. I'm going to make sure that they are there and post it correctly, but the other course instructors are going to need to know what you're working on to make sure they can guide your practice. You guys are doing some really exciting things in practicum. It's really cool for me to see a good mix of students who are working in the academic setting as well as the hospital setting. So it gives me a great exposure of what's really going on in both settings. So for me, it was interesting to be able to do that. Your discussion boards, I went through this morning and gave you some feedback. This is one of those discussion boards that really takes some time to think about. So the objective was for you to come up with a teaching strategy that, when properly implemented, could cover the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains of learning. So you really have to understand those three domains of learning pretty well and have an idea of how that plays out in the use of effective teaching strategies. You guys came up with some great strategies, from simulation to gaming. Someone suggested using Kahoot It. Team simulation, individual simulation, using the flipped classroom. Several of you used case studies, and role playing were some of the highlighted ones. These are all great. And what's interesting is all of them are active learning strategies. We have moved so far from the sage on the stage approach of facilitating learning, where you would have students walk in and the professor would stand in front of the classroom and pontificate on all the information they wanted to impart, and everyone would scramble and write notes as fast as they could and then walk away feeling just completely exhausted and not really understanding anything they wrote down, only knowing that they had to gather as much information from the lecturer as possible. That's a passive learning strategy. I was delighted to see you all really looking at the active learning strategies. And folks, I don't want to dismiss the value of a well-developed lecture. What we know is that students listen for about 20 minutes, and they get about 30 to 40% of what you're saying in that 20 minutes. So you really need to hit salient points. What are the most important things about a topic that you need your students to know? And then work with active teaching strategies in the classroom that really help the rubber hit the road, help them really understand, this is what my faculty member has lectured me about for 15 or 20 minutes, and these are the strategies that we're going to use to practice those key points. And the other thing to remember is we should be testing on those key points. So if we really are talking about the important things and we're using active strategies to help them apply the important things, then we should be doing assessment and evaluation on those same important things. One of the things that makes me crazy as a student, as a faculty member, is see faculty spend so much time and energy talking about key concepts, and then when they write and develop their testing formats, they focus on crazy things from little areas in the book or tables or forms, that the students aren't even going to read and that weren't discussed in class, but they show up on a test. So we surely should be testing and evaluating our students on the things that are important and using our classroom time to apply innovative teaching strategies that are active to help engage our students and learn. So I really appreciate you guys doing that. One thing I want to point out is the complexity of doing biblical integration. And this is not just for discussion boards, although I think it's a little easier to feel not as committed to making a high valued effort in this in a discussion board, but also in our writing. It is so important that while you're enrolled at Liberty University, and one of our big cornerstones in your education is helping you develop your thoughts about what it means to be a Christian nurse educator in a pretty secular world. For you to be able to go through your assignments and do more than drop verses into paragraphs without integration. So I want you to practice that skill and be very thoughtful that when you find a biblical verse that is relevant to your topic and you want to include it and give it context, that you need to do more than copy and paste it from whichever search engine you're using, paste it into the body of your work and cite it. You've got to say why it matters. In the discussion boards, two of your classmates did a really nice job of this. Amanda wrote, while the skills and tasks of nursing may be the most obvious educational need to someone looking in the profession from the outside, a nurse cannot be made from an empty-headed, empty-hearted automaton. Knowledge, cognitive, compassion and love, affective, as well as the skill and work, psychomotor, disciplines of nursing must be taught and learned. James chapter 3 verse 17 tells us, the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. This kind of wisdom is holistic in domain, and it is the kind of wisdom I wish for my students. So Amanda has chosen to use a direct quote, which is fine, and embedding it into that holistic component of educating, of tying it in with the value of using all three domains and the impact that has on the students. So she has taken James chapter 3 verse 17 and really contextualized it in the value of using the domains of learning to create a whole picture, much like James was talking about wisdom in that verse. So that's a good example of how we can take a verse, embed it into our writing, and give it context. The other classmate, Laura, did a great job too. Laura wrote, I love your suggestion for the affective learning portion of your lesson. Each one really demonstrates the frustration a patient is left with after a stroke. John chapter 11, verse 33 through 35 says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and troubled. Jesus wept. It's a great lesson on compassion and empathy towards our patients and family. I'm going to take some of your examples and use them with my own students. So again, Laura is referencing what one of your other classmates did. I think it was Elizabeth, that wrote about her bubblegum exercise and having the students try to speak with a bunch of bubblegum balls in their mouth and how challenging that was related to a stroke. So Laura is talking about the sense of frustration in that affective domain of working with a patient with a stroke and tying that to the level of compassion we can have that Jesus demonstrated in his own grief with compassion towards our patients who had a stroke and what that looks like. And she's right, it's a great lesson in compassion and empathy. So having the student activity and then tying it with John and then her own practice, that's an integration of compassion that comes very clearly through that biblical message. Again, both of these ladies chose to do direct quotes, which is great. When sometimes your Bible verses get very unwieldy. They're verses that don't make sense unless you put them with 3 or 4 verses. So you wind up with huge chunks of Bible verse that when you put into a paper can get unwieldy. I'm going to encourage you to be okay paraphrasing. Be okay with understanding what God's word is and being able to place it into the body of your work with a proper citation. Short verses like these, it's okay to do a direct quote. Just be careful as you move forward. If it gets unwieldy, be willing to paraphrase it. God wants you to know what the Bible means. Okay, so those are some examples of biblical integration. I'm going to encourage you to avoid dropping verses into the bodies of paragraphs without context, without connecting it to meaning. That's not biblical integration. That's, it's kind of like name dropping. You're putting something in there and then walking away. So I want you to avoid doing that. Okay, let's talk briefly about next week. You're going to be working on your practicum log number 1. Many of you have only been able to attend the practicum setting for last week or maybe part of this week. So if you only have one day, that's okay. You'll catch up with the rest of the course in the next couple of weeks. Your log should be well developed. Before you put in your log, I want you to go into Typhon and go into the time log. Add your hours for your goals and objective development. You're going to put the hours that you've accrued, make sure that they are put in the duration column as well as your goals and objective column. It will be in two places. Your duration column should be a running total of all the hours you have accumulated. If you've worked on your goals and objectives over 3 or 4 days, just pick a day and put the total hours that were accumulated. You don't have to put every single day you worked on them. I know that was a progressive assignment. But if you worked on them for 7 hours, pick a date within the grading period, put the total 7 hours, put the hours under duration as well as the goals and objective hours so that they appear in two places. Remember, the duration column is going to be where all of your hours should total, and when you're finishing 620, that column should have 200 hours in it. Okay. Once you've done that, then you're going to work on your practicum log. In Blackboard, you have a guide for your log development. I want you to follow that closely. Your rubric is aligned with that. So the first box is your goals and objectives. Only put the goals and objectives that you worked on during those days you were in the practicum setting. Do not copy and paste every single goal and objective into that box. Only put the ones that you're working on and state whether they have whether they're ongoing, whether they're met. And you can put those if you have several goals and objectives for that one day, put them in that box and then just put parentheses after each of them if they're ongoing or met. So you can do that without having to create multiple tables. In your supportive narrative section, that's the second box, you're going to give the details of how you spent your time in the practicum setting and your thoughts and reflections about how you spent your time in the practicum setting. It's important that you don't just create a chronology of this is what I did and this is who I did it with and this is where I went, but that you also put and this is what I thought about this experience. These were my aha moments. This is the pearls of wisdom that I walked away. These are the insights I had from this experience. That's the piece of affective domain of reflective thinking and then reflective writing that we want in that supportive narrative section. If you were in the practicum setting 2 hours versus 10 hours, the amount of information in that supportive narrative section is going to vary greatly. But if you've been in the practicum setting for, let's say, 10 hours and you put, just a handful of sentences, that's going to be woefully inadequate to fully explain how you spent your time in the practicum setting. So be detailed that's appropriate to the time that you spent. Okay? Your application section is going to be where you do your analysis. This is where you say, these are the goals and objectives I worked on, and this is how it relates to what I actually did in the practicum setting. This is how it relates to the NLN competencies. This is how it relates to things I knew before my class, and this is how it's growing me as an individual. You've got to do all that fancy footwork in just a couple of sentences. So kind of create a little script for yourself so that every time you go in to do the application section, you understand that it's an analysis. You're going to talk about how your experiences helped address the goals and objectives related to the NLN, related to your prior learning and how that came together in that period with your preceptor, and then how you were demonstrating growth and development in the role of a nurse educator. Work towards really pulling all those concepts together. I think the application section is the hardest part because it's more than just reporting what you experienced and thinking about it. It's actually a good analysis of those experiences. This is how we're going to tell you're growing in the role of a nurse educator. You have to do more than just shadow and watch. You've got to be thinking, creating, exploring things. So this application section, again, is the analysis that occurs. So you've got those 3 sections. For every day that you're in the practicum setting, there's going to be an entry into the log. Each log has 8 entry opportunities. So if you've been in the practicum setting for 2 days, in that log, you're only going to use 2 of the log entries in your practicum log. If you've been in the practicum setting for more than 8 days, you're going to have to copy and paste some additional tables to the end of that log. Okay, I think I've covered everything. Make sure that you're citing the NLN in your application section. If you want to just do it once at the bottom of the paper, that's fine. It just has to be somewhere with a full reference, somewhere in your tool. Okay. That's your practicum log. The other thing you've got is your discussion board. The discussion board is a fun one. It's talking, it has you exploring the idea of student misconduct, specifically annoying acts. When we deal with plagiarism or conduct issues, we have policies and procedures around that. So I'm not going to have you discussing that. I want you to talk with your peers about the annoying acts that occur when you are in the role of a nurse educator. For me, they don't happen as often as I feel like they did when I originally started teaching, but every once in a while I still run into a student behaving pretty obnoxiously and having to navigate dealing with the student's behavior without estranging the student from the course objectives, without estranging the student from me, so that I can't properly facilitate their learning because of my approach in dealing with the behavior. It's probably been a year or so ago. I teach an undergraduate leadership course, and I had a student who was sitting at the front of the class, always had his back to the wall and had his computer turned so that no one could really see what he was looking at. And he was way too entertained during class when I was lecturing, and I could tell he wasn't taking notes. He was clearly paying attention to something else on his laptop, and it was disruptive. So after class, I asked him to stop, and I said, jokingly, I said, "I'm a fantastic lecturer, but you seem a great deal more entertained than I really am. Talk to me about what's going on your laptop." And he got a little embarrassed and he said, "Well, sometimes I get bored." I was like, "Okay, tell me what it is that in class you find difficult to pay attention to." It's like, "Well, I don't really do really well with listening to somebody lecture." So, okay, I think that's fair. Listening to lecture can be a little unexciting, no matter how fabulous I am. Tell me some things that you feel like help you learn better. And he was able to say, "Well, I do better when we do group activities. I do better when we do hands-on stuff." I said, "Okay." So I explained to him there are going to be times when you're just going to have to endure a lecture. And I get that that's not thrilling, but it's so important to me that you're attentive and respectful of my time. And know that while it won't happen every class, but most classes are going to involve active learning strategies. And I talked about kind of the blueprint for the next couple of weeks for that class, about things that he could expect to look forward to that would be more in his interest level. I was kind, I was respectful, and I addressed a behavior that after that point it stopped. Partly because I think he knew that I was paying attention and I think he was a little embarrassed. And the other part was he saw me making good on my commitment, which was not to lecture him to death for the entire 14 weeks of the course. Unfortunately, at the time we were doing theory and no one wants to listen to theory, but you got to have it. So he just needed to hang in there. Think about the times that you either as a student have observed annoying acts or you as a faculty member or educator have experienced someone demonstrating them to you, and really think about appropriate ways to handle that and use some biblical integration to explore those concepts. I hope you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving week. I have family coming in, which means I'm going to be cooking and cleaning. So I may, normally I'm pretty quick about replying. So if there's a little bit of a delay, know that it's probably because I'm buried in the kitchen up to my elbows in stuffing or potatoes or something exciting. We have lots of traditions in our family, and this year we're breaking all the rules, and I have finally convinced everyone to not have turkey for Thanksgiving, and I'm so excited. We're going to do porchetta, which it's a pork dish that has pork belly and a pork loin, and it may taste horrible, but it won't be turkey, and I'm so excited. So say a prayer for me sometime, Thursday morning, that the porchetta comes out okay. Otherwise, I'm going to be stuck with turkey in 2018. So, whatever your traditions are, I hope they are filled with blessings and joy, that you feel fully loved, that your cup overflows with all of God's grace and His blessings this week, that everyone has safe travels. Know that I'm here, know that I'm praying for you. Touch base and let me know how I can support you in any way. I will look forward to hearing from you and seeing your work from this week next week. Take care.